to Unit 3, Part 2. I hope you had a emotionally moving time, deep time with yourself and this letter that you wrote to someone in the future. I want to now take us into how do we deal with these strong emotions? Because as you can imagine, you're not the only one who has them. And it's quite likely that your audience is as deeply touched by what is happening on our planet, and they might be conscious about that and be able to deal with that and not throw it at you. But many people just, are not very conscious about their emotions, and they start screaming at you, or they start, resisting you, or they just ignore you and actively try to avoid dealing with things. And so I want you to understand these kinds of defenses and how we best deal with that, what's behind that. The first place to maybe start is to remind you of something that you already know, which is the thing that we so often hear about, the fight, flight, or freeze response. When people are deeply threatened by something, and, as the first part of this unit suggested, we are existentially threatened by climate change. There is, ways in which we respond to this that are just not particularly constructive. They're inadequate, at least. The fight response is one where, we get violent or aggressive, both in language and in behavior sometimes. Here in the US, there are unfortunately far too many examples of people who are really annoyed with climate change sending death threats to scientists. I'm not making this up. This is really how seriously people are reacting to this issue in a very unkind and obviously dangerous way. The more common thing is people just running away from the topic, simply distracting themselves, denying it, or engaging in contrarianism, actively, fighting against what scientists are saying and what politicians are saying who say we need to act on this. And maybe the most common response is from the vast majority of the population, which is to simply say nothing, to just freeze and declare ourselves helpless. We can't do anything. We have no power. There's nothing we can do to affect the future. And so often we, reinforce that, or we see that in people avoiding to talk about it at all. There's an enormous silence about a life-threatening issue like this. Imagine COVID was going on and nobody talked about it. That's what I mean. And, climate change doesn't have the kind of immediacy as the COVID crisis right now has for us, but it is as, or even far more threatening than COVID is to many, many more millions of people. And yet we barely talk about it, not nearly as much as it would demand. So this is the kind of stuff that you see, and that's obviously inadequate. There's a fourth F, a fourth response, and that is the friending, the befriending or forming bonds response we could have. And that is actually what you would love for people to do, and what you anyways want people to do through your communication. You want them to connect with each other, to build that social capital and social support systems, to face the threat together, to share how we feel about it and share our stories, and then basically using that energy that's no longer suppressed toward strategic action, to supporting each other, to reconnecting with nature, and finding, if you will, what we do, or connecting what we do with our deepest purpose for being alive as humans on this planet at this time. So in many ways, it's about dedicating yourself to something larger than your own personal little safety. That is ultimately what will probably get us through that kind of behavior, and what you want to foster with your communication. Now, what happens is that when people hear about threatening information, that they respond to this with their heart first, with their emotional brain first, and then come to sort of rationally assess, now what are we going to do with this? I already went through in the last unit, just this is a reminder here, to all the emotional responses we do have. And this is the first experience. It's not pleasant often, and there are predictable ways in which we respond to those unpleasant experiences. And I want you to really take this one in. This is a very important slide in this particular unit. And that has to do with what we do when we are faced with something as threatening as this. We do one of two things. We either reduce the threat actively, eliminate it or minimize it so we don't, have the threat anymore. Or if we cannot do that, we reduce the unpleasant feeling about the threat. Why? Because we are just as humans incapable of just staring a ginormous threat in the face and not do anything. We just can't. Try that. It just doesn't work. And so the implication for communication of knowing this particular propensity that we have psychologically is that you never, ever only talk about climate risks. You always combine your risk information with solution information. That way, we actually know what to do. We can use our motivation, from the threat, from the fears that we experience. We can use that toward reducing the threat as opposed to sticking our heads in the sand. But people will defend and don't want to hear it. So it happens many, many times, and in part because of our communication failures, because we have so long just talked about the science and the threats, the impacts from climate change, and not talked enough about what to do about it. So I want you to basically, in the next few slides, get a sense of what these defenses are that we put up when we stick our heads in the sand, when we don't want to hear about it. You will probably find that this is something you encounter again and again, whether it's, around the family dinner table or with friends or with your colleagues even, or in the general public. These defenses are alive and well. I'm using here a synthesis of work done by Paris de Stoknes, who is a Norwegian psychologist, and he basically brought together a lot of different psychological literature around how we defend against information we don't want, against feelings we don't want to have. The first one of these is what we call psychological distance. Each one of these layers of defense starts with a D, so that might make it easier to remember for you. Psychological distance is basically where we keep something at arm's length. We don't want to basically think or feel anything about what this disturbing thing is. How do we do that? Oh, it's going to happen in 100 years from now. Oh, it happens to other species. Oh, it happens in other countries, right? So we just, it's not happening here. It's not to me, not to my community. We just put it somewhere else in another time, in another place, to other species, so that we don't have to worry. It's the easiest and quickest way to get rid of an issue. Just make it go away. It's only obviously psychologically gone away. It's not actually away. So this is just a way in which we defend against not wanting to feel something. We avoid the issue that way. We keep the focus on the here and now. We distract ourselves, or sometimes you hear that, and when people have this optimism bias, oh, it's going to be fine. Don't worry about it. It's not going to be bad. And we reinforce it inadvertently if we don't ever talk about climate change. We just allow people to stay emotionally, psychologically distant to it, right? We don't bring it into their living rooms, into their consciousness, into their work. Even when we focus on urgent current issues, I mean, how many people have you recently heard during this coronavirus crisis to talk about climate change? It's impossible almost to get through, right? It's another way to keep something far away. Or to say things like, oh, we got time. Don't worry, we can cope. Those are the ways in which we do that. Now imagine for a moment that you actually allowed yourself to let that information in, or whoever you're speaking to, lets it in and say, okay, I'll consider what you just said. What happens is they then would feel how it could impact them, how it could take away something that they love or threaten something. Well, and we have another defense against that, and that's the doom defense. We don't want to feel loss or grief. You know, if I just asked you to think about the death of a loved one, just that in that moment, what defense went up in you? That's what I mean. People have that about climate change too. They do not want to feel the threat, the loss to everything that they love or depend on, whether that's their job, their homes, their property, or anything, a landscape that they love. So the doom defense is really an avoidance of the feelings of loss or grief, or a defense against feeling those things. We avoid the issue. We just don't even want to think about loss at all. You know, we frame climate change only in terms of opportunity. That's one way to do that, right? Or, you know, we transfer the responsibility to for this to someone else, so we just don't have to worry about it ourselves. And oftentimes as communicators, we can inadvertently actually make that defense go up really fast. Just look at these pictures here. All doom and gloom pictures, right? Who wants to look at this all the time? You might have used on your websites or in your brochures or in your talks slides of, I don't know, bleached reefs, right? Of course, you want to educate people about that. But the moment you do that, you have just poked people in this particular defense because they just love the reefs. They want them to be alive and well and rich and diverse and, you know, all those things. And so that's how, in such a subtle way, you can actually just run right into the wall of this particular defense. Now, imagine for a moment, again, you or whoever you're speaking to would actually listen to you and say, yeah, those things are actually threatened. I'll consider, I'm listening to you, I'm hearing what you're saying. Now, what would be the natural response to that? The minute you hear that something that you love is threatened, you actually want to protect it, right? You want to do something about it. But what if you don't know what to do? Or you don't believe that you have any power to do anything, or you just don't know how? Well, then that's when we get into cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is basically when there's a difference between what you know and what you do. And they're not congruent. You're not acting, you know, in a way that is consistent with what you know. And it would produce the outcome that you feel guilty. Well, who among us wants to feel guilty? We don't. So we go to great lengths to, and increasingly so, you can see how the further in we go with these defenses, closer to our core, the louder the voices get that fight, that you hear in public meetings. And that's when you start to hear people doubting the science, or when you see people, this is actually an interesting phenomenon, exhibit confirmation bias or motivated reasoning. What that means is that people basically only take in the information that is consistent with what they already believe. When you say something that is inconsistent with that, they just simply ignore you, or they just dismiss it, or they literally cannot hear you. They might, you know, go home and tell somebody else about this talk, and they never ever mention this one thing that was disconnected from or incongruent with what they believe, because it just didn't go in. It's a really fascinating phenomenon. So, you know, these are just examples of how people who are in this cognitive dissonance place, what they might do to avoid feeling guilty. Now, imagine for a moment you actually succeeded to convince someone that, you know, it's actually important that you act. Now, they might be the only one in their family, the only one in the office, the only one in their party, the only one in their business sector to take that action. And what does that mean? They will risk this sense of, I am one of this group. I am one of this social group that I'm a part of. I am one of my, you know, I'm the one who's respected in this profession. If you go out on a limb and you do something different, you risk losing your social ties. And oh, does that bring out not such great quality in us. When we are actually at risk of losing what is evolutionary so important, right? That we are connected to others, that we face threats together. You will go to even greater lengths to deny climate change and anything about it. So actively fighting against it, defending yourself for not acting, not doing anything, really justifying that you're essentially not able to take a stance on this. You're not able to take that next step, or even getting worse and attacking others. There's a very interesting sort of dynamic where all of a sudden we start really just defending what people like me, are doing, and start attacking everybody who's doing something. Oh, these green liberals, all of a sudden we start having language like this where people start name calling the people who are different, who are already acting on this issue, and we start to put them down. So it's an interesting way in which you can gauge whether this is going on. Enemy narratives are the kinds of things. We must fight the fossil fuel industry, our number one enemy, whatever. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that, we hear in international politics and so in movements where people start to use a lot of military language, a lot of violent language. It's a good sign that something increasingly intense is going on in them. Now, again, let's imagine for a moment you decided, it's more important to me to act on it and be true to what I just learned, even if I risk being all by myself, and even if I'm the only one in my family taking this action, even if I'm the only one in this village or whatever, right? Now, if you do that, you might have to take an action that is completely different and inconsistent with what you have done all your life. Imagine that fossil fuel boss who has seen the light, if you will, and is deciding to give up what the business that they've been in for all this time. They would have to change not just their job and their practices, they would have to actually change who they understand themselves to be. And this is not something we do every Tuesday. This is not something that that we would do easily. In fact, if any one of you changes your identity more than once or twice in your life, congratulations. It is very unusual, to say the least. We simply do not like giving up on who we think we are. Imagine you have to do something as a parent that is completely contrary to how you thought of yourself as a parent in order for you to be consistent with climate change. Or you always wanted to be a parent, a mother, a father, whatever, and you decide you're not going to have any children because of climate change. Now that's really, really deeply grappling with, or requiring you to grapple with, who you are as an individual. Again, we don't like doing that. And so we get really nasty defending against that possibility to be asked to be something completely different. Not only by avoiding the issue and denying the issue, but maybe all of a sudden feigning this complete helplessness, or reinforcing ever more strongly who you are and why you can't change, attacking others just in this self-defense kind of mode. So these are the kinds of ways when people get really, really nasty or really playing dead, if you will, helpless, that something very profound is going on. I've heard a lot of you speak about people being fatalistic and helpless. Well, that's also super convenient, isn't it? I mean, yes, there is a reality to it. I'm not denying it. But there's also a way in which that kind of stance lets other people control your life, and it's kind of doesn't ask much of you. But if you were to say, you know what, I'm going to step up. I'm going to not let somebody else write my life, my future. It would have to, you're no longer a helpless person. You would have to really change who you are. And that's what we're talking about here. So these are 5 layers of defenses. And what I want you to do here is, in a moment, pause this after I explain the exercise. Go to the Google folder, look for exercise 8, and brainstorm a couple of situations, real life, that you've lived through, where someone came with what looks like an emotional response to climate change to you. Maybe they were angry, maybe they were apathetic, maybe they were attacking you. Maybe they were, undermining, I don't know, the science or any of those behaviors that I just went through. And I want you to think about, what was that situation? What did they say? And how did I respond to that? And given what I now know, how might I do that differently? And just as an additional resource to this, I'm going to put into the folder an article I wrote about basically what our options are of how to counter the 5Ds, if you will, those typical responses. What can you do as a communicator? There's a long table in that article, and you can just see if, are there some good ideas in there for you that you can use to maybe encounter these situations differently. And then, do that for a couple of situations, get together with your partner and share those examples, and then, talk through what is your best possible response here. Could you be more compassionate? Could you be more encouraging? Is there a way in which you can motivate people or support them or involve them in action? And I want you to help each other out. Like, these are the most difficult and uncomfortable situations for you as a communicator. I totally realize that. So help each other out in how to, be authentic and come across in a convincing manner, but maybe do that in a way that, you're just not getting into a tit-for-tat battle with people and reacting or being stunned to silence yourself and avoid, doing another presentation for the next 3 months. Like, what could you do better? And then after you've gone back and forth a couple times, reflect on it. What did you discover? What seems to work? What appears to be the biggest challenge, your triggers where you get just trapped into and pulled into these arguments and just, where you just walk away afterwards feeling really unpleasant. Like, man, I didn't do well in this particular conversation. So what, is there any way in which you can help each other out, sort of distill some kernels of what works, and bring that to the next exercise? So stop or put the pause button here and get together with your partner to do this exercise. And then when you come back, we'll go a little bit further. I want to, in this next step here, just introduce you to something that is yet another degree more annoying. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it. This is not something that I heard a lot about in your pre-training surveys, but I do want to simply offer it in case this becomes an issue for you and you want to have a resource there. And that is what I call the contrarian approach. This is the people who make it a point to make your life hard, to be as annoying possibly as they can to you as you're trying to do your climate change work. So they're not just, a little skeptical, a little defended. These are the people who are actively trying to put barriers in your way, if you will, undermining your credibility, attacking you, attacking everything you say, anything like that, right? This is, if you will, the army of people, the counter movement to climate action that is actually there to retain the status quo. That is what they're motivated by. And, you can see, even if you think back to the 5Ds, how this is very much about, avoiding the loss of social ties, avoiding having to change their identity. So it's at that, this is the people who are touched at those deepest layers of psychological defense, who then make it their business to make your day really a bad one. There is a sequence to this of how they typically go about in the climate arena to argue against whatever it is that you have to say. And I want to say to you, this is typical for climate change, and it was used in this exact same way for anti-smoking campaign. And there are probably 10 more examples you can find where there was some kind of science issue that demanded action, and people those contrarians went through that same sequence of arguments. And it goes typically like this. First, they deny that this is happening at all. Either saying, your evidence is just not good enough, or they bring you one piece of contradictory evidence, typically something completely weird, it doesn't nothing to do with the situation. Or if, they sort of even accept that something's happening because it's becoming increasingly impossible to deny that, they might say, well, it might be happening, but we don't know why, right? So that means we don't know for sure that it's humans, and we certainly shouldn't do anything if we can't be sure that it's us. That's a very common example. And so, the typical arguments you see listed here of how people come up with that. And then they might say, well, even if it's happening, it's all natural. They simply deny the human causation issue, and they speak about natural cycles, and it's always been like that, and CO2 is all natural, and all of those sorts of things. That's again, a way in which certainly you would be then free to not act, right, if it was all natural. Maybe you still need adaptation, but certainly you don't need to do any mitigation. And then the next thing happens. Then they say, well, even if it's happening, and even if we caused it, climate change is actually not going to be so bad, or maybe it's even good for us. And they come up with the most obscure selection of factoids to tell you how, it's just not a bad thing, or it's going to be wonderful. So you might have heard that. People who simply don't want to take that as seriously as maybe this unit suggests. And then the last sort of stage in this series of denial arguments is that they might acknowledge that the issue is happening, even that we cause it, and maybe even that some of those impacts could be bad for us. But they will argue there's nothing you can do about it, or it's just too expensive. It will ruin us to act on it, so let's not. It's too late is a typical argument. It's for someone else to do, or the economic argument that it's just too expensive. So this is like I said, a sequence that you will find again and again and again. When you encounter someone like this, there are certain things I would recommend you don't do, like start name calling or shouting matches with them, or arguing tit for tat and really getting pulled into the argument. They would like nothing more than to pull you into an argument with them rather than you saying what you want to say. Distract you from your messages and be all engulfed in their messages. So you might go as far as correcting some of the worst mistakes, particularly if you're in front of an audience and they might have just said something completely blatantly different or false. But you don't want to get into an argument. Instead, what I really strongly encourage you to do is to sort of listen for those signs of the stages of denial, or those 5 Ds, those psychological defenses I introduced you to, and see if there's something you can say to de-escalate, to depolarize the situation. And the best way to do that is to say something nice about them. You really bring up a really interesting point. I can see that you have really studied this in some depth. You've just given them a compliment, right? So the minute you say that, and then you transition and reframe the debate as something that you want to talk about. You might even say, the argument that you're putting out there to me really sounds like we're talking about what kind of future do we want. So now all of a sudden this is no longer about the science or the models or, the economy. It's really about a value argument, and that is an argument that everyone can participate in. When you're technically debating over the merits of this model versus that climate model or whatever, that might not be very helpful, but you can engage people on what future do we want, and what do we, how do we get there? And I'll come back in a moment here to this last comment about being a friendly communicator. So here's the exercise I want to just offer to you if you have been in situations like this. If you don't, or if you're not likely to encounter it, then just simply know that this is here. You can go back to it, but it's basically an exercise in dealing with those kinds of professional, annoying people, those contrarians. And just work on it as you will. What you see there is an exercise that I want you all to know about, and it's a practice I call ATM. You all know the automated teller machines at banks that might help you remember this, but ATM stands for answer or acknowledge, transition, and then back to your message. What that really means is that, so here is this contrarian argument, economy is going to be ruined, and you might say, I really hear your concern here about our economic well-being, right? So you've really acknowledged what he just said. But the argument really that we had, or what that brings up for me, that's the transition. And then you're back to something you want to say. Your 3 or 4 messages from last time we did that exercise. So you basically, you give them a sense that they're heard, and then you find a phrase, a sentence, a 2-sentence transition that, makes that sound not quite so automated, or just something that brings you to the portal of where you can say again what you want to say, your messages. So I want you to practice that. It's a really good exercise, especially those of you who have to work with the press. You might have actually encountered this. So work with your message triangle, your message box, and practice ATM. And you can do that in the context of, someone who is really annoying and trying to undermine your communication efforts. But if you don't have that situation, you can skip this particular exercise. Now, I want to come back to this issue that all of you can use, and that is the issue of coming as a friendly communicator, or as I like to say, the communicator as friend. What do I mean by that? Now, have you ever gone over to your friend's house and before you even said hello, you just started talking about climate science? You would never do that, right? You would say, hi, how are you? How is your mother? How is, I don't know, the pet or the kids or anything, right? You would somehow connect with your audience on a personal level before you come to whatever it is that you came to talk about. That is what I want you to do with all of your climate change communication. Connect first. And you do that by acknowledging them, by validating your audience. I'm so glad you came out here tonight, to this public meeting, or whatever it is. I'm so delighted that you took time on a Saturday to come to a business meeting so we can talk about how to make the sector more energy efficient, or, you've just said something nice. You just connected to them. You just acknowledged they made an effort. You affirm their sense of self. Maybe they're business leaders, maybe they're family members who have to worry a lot about something right now with COVID or whatever it is, right? So you affirm something positive about them, which opens them up, of course. They listen to you much better than if you come with doom and gloom, fear-threatening science information. And maybe another way to do that is to appreciate something they've done. You've always showed leadership in this community. And I think we are here to really think about how we can take this a step further. It's a way to do that, right? You just said something nice. You acknowledged an aspiration that they have to be seen as leaders. And then you speak about your issue, climate, or whatever it is that you want to talk about, in ways that they care about, not how you care about it. Sometimes that can work, but it's a more challenging situation. So if you speak to it in the ways that, that's something that they treasure or value or aspire to, who they want to be or who they already are, the way they connect to the place, their culture, any of those things. You just, this is what we did the other day with the framing. You have just found a way in terms that are relevant and resonant with that particular audience. You also sympathize with their struggle. I hear you. You're concerned about how, the crops are failing, or how this might cost a lot of money to do, or how this might change your business practice. You just, being empathetic about what this audience might face, again, opens them up and makes them feel like you're on their side. You want to be on your audience side as opposed to being seen as the opposition. And then it is up to you to connect whatever you want them to do to something they already do. See, you've already taken all these actions. Now you can just take it one step further, right? So it's a continuum. And that sense of the continuum, it's also tapping into a social norm. Like, this is the thing we do here. This is normal. This is just the next logical step. It will make it much easier for people to recognize. Tapping in any way that you can into their positive emotions, like things like the curiosity, interest, passion, what we talked about in the first part of this particular unit. Any way in which you can imagine doing that. And then finally, to actually give people hope. I'll come back to that in a moment in much greater detail. But this particular strategy or set of steps that you can take, I want you to just keep that in mind and apply it as you think through, can I say my key messages in any way like this? Or when I go to a meeting, can I follow this kind of approach? And see what kind of different reactions you get. I have a feeling that if you come across as this friendly, empathetic communicator, you'll be trusted more easily. And trusted communicators are far more effective than the people who we're skeptical about. You all know this. Just think about who you trust. What is it? Think about someone who exhibits these kinds of traits, who does meetings in this way, how much further they get. So think about that. The issue of hope. The magnitude of what we're facing and what I talked about in the first part of this unit is really challenging to face with lots of all these emotions that we talked about. It's really an increasingly dark future. And at least here in the US, I don't know if this is something you're encountering already, but at least here, I get the requests for how do I keep people's hope up. I get that now all the time. When I first started doing communication trainings, it was all about how do I communicate science. And then it was all about how do I deal with the skeptics. And now it's about how do I deal with people's emotions and help people keep their hope up. Because it is very late. And the trajectory of how to get to 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming, beyond which things become much, much more difficult to deal with, that is a really challenging future to think about. Here's a statement from the novelist Raymond Williams that I really like. To be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. So often in the environmental community, we have used the threat to the things we love in nature as our biggest weapon, if you will, in communication. What if we turn that around? What if we actually focused on trying to help people truly be hopeful? And by that, I don't mean, some pink, rosy optimism that everything will be fine, but a true and authentic hope. Can we get there? Can we then translate that in how we communicate? Well, I think it's worth looking at what is hope. I spent a lot of time thinking about it. This is a picture of my bookshelf. It even is fuller by now. Been reading around a lot of different fields, disciplines, and different ways of thinking about hope. And here's what I've learned about that. In the psychological literature, people have so many different definitions of hope. It's an attitude. It's a way to maintain motivation. It's a skill. It's a mechanism. It's a motivation. It's an attribute. It's a motivating force. I mean, it's like all over the place, right? That's psychology. Then here's an interesting factor. This comes out of medicine. Hope is actually an influential factor in health, healing, and well-being. It's been shown that people who have hope live longer. They heal faster after surgery. They stay healthier. In economics, it's the result of economic and social empowerment. That's an interesting one. Completely different than any of the other ones, right? In philosophy, maybe it's a meta-narrative or a prerequisite for or a byproduct of spiritual attainment. Interestingly, an extension of suffering or a moral duty. Look at this set. This is just 10 examples, 10 definitions of how we might think about hope. Now, I think there's a way to synthesize a lot of this stuff, and I want to introduce you to one set of definitions and then give you my own that I've developed after a very long time of thinking about this. But the first one here is based on two people's work. One is, again, this psychologist, Paris de Stoknes, that I mentioned to you before with the 5 Ds. He thought about hope both in terms of how we think about the outcome and how we think about getting there. And then there is additional author here, Jonathan Lear, an anthropologist, who yet has another idea. Let me walk you through this sort of sequence. The first kind of hope that Stokeness talks about is what he sometimes calls Pollyanna hope, or passive optimism. It's the idea that, the future is going to be fine and I don't have to do anything about it. It's just going to be wonderful, we're going to be okay. Basically, no active involvement, it all is going to turn out good. I don't think this is the kind of hope that will get us through climate change. There's a second kind of hope that is also still convinced that the future is going to be okay, but in order for it to be good, we're going to have to take heroic action. That's what he calls heroic hope, or active optimism. Now, you see that sometimes in the climate change arena, right? Where people really are calling now on us to be heroes and to take really substantial action. But still, this conviction is going to be fine. There's a variation on that, and that is what he calls stoic hope, or passive skepticism. You're beginning to see the pattern here. This is one where people are not exactly convinced that the future is going to be rosy at all. It could possibly be difficult, but we're going to be able to handle it. Stoically, we can just deal with it, whatever comes. So again, you don't have to do much about it, but this is no longer about it's all going to be fine. We're just able to cope. And you hear that in the climate change arena. The fourth variety that Stokeness introduced is what he calls grounded hope, or active skepticism. And that is where you're not at all convinced that the future is going to be good, but you can simply not live with yourself if you do not do everything in your power to make a difference, to make it as good as it can be, to work toward the best possible outcome. That's a hope that fully acknowledges the seriousness of the science and the situation we're in, and still puts everything toward a better outcome. Now, I think that's probably one of those varieties of hope that is going to go a long way with climate change, but I don't think it's as far as we can think. So that's where I draw on Jonathan Lear's notion of radical hope. And what he means by that is that we don't even know what the future is going to be, whether that's good or bad, and we have no idea whether what we can do is good or bad. The means to get to that end are good or bad. We have to completely rethink and remake everything, and including how we think and how we judge and evaluate what is good or bad about that future. I think that kind of hope, that might be one we might have to tap into more and more. So those are 5 varieties of hope. The last 2, the grounded hope and the radical hope, is what informs my own definition about hope. And I use this image to convey it. Think, where these people are going. They're moving in the picture toward, the direction to the right, to the back, what is in the rower's back. So they're not looking at a future, but they're putting their entire power against, toward moving in that direction of that unknown future. So for me, this is the kind of effort that we need to keep hope alive in darkening times. The long version of that is to say that we don't know what's going to happen. There's big uncertainty, big change happening, and in part it's because we're not certain about the future that we need hope. So standing on this foundation of uncertainty and change, hope arises from the tension between a deep understanding of history and a bold vision of an unwritten future. Let me just say a word about that. Why history now all of a sudden? Because if we don't know how social change comes about, we don't know what to do. So we draw from history as inspiration and knowledge about how to change the trajectory of time, right? And we are then moving toward a future that is desirable and it's not yet set in stone. You know, if it was already set in stone, then why bother having hope? It needs to be uncertain. It needs to be unwritten. So it's a motivation experienced right now in the present, combined with our ability to see far and commit to contributing constructively to building that desirable future. That's a lot. That's a mouthful. Here's 3 ways to put it. It's that foundation of uncertainty and change. It's that vision of a desirable future. And it's a sense of agency, a sense of choice and efficacy, a sense that we can make a difference, and then acting on that. Here's, you know, just a plethora of ideas of how you can do each one of these things. Let's start with a desirable future. What if you did visioning exercises? What if you invited much more creativity into your community meetings and expanded the circle of who gets to be there? Who has a voice? Can you listen to others and hear what is it that they love, what they would love to see? You know, things are already not so great. Do they maybe have an element of the future that if you brought that in, they might be engaged? They might be, yes, I'm going to come along and work with you. Maybe there is, you know, ways in which you can use art or any other way to foster imagination and go a little bit beyond what people think is possible. There's so many ways in which we limit our imagination. So set the bar higher. Think about what's one step beyond what we think is you know, feasible. Can we go beyond that? So just ways in which you can maybe evoke that a little bit and get people really to grapple with what is it we want from the future. Here's some ideas for the agency side. Can you demonstrate to people how to enact a solution? Not just say, you know, go change your light bulbs or go change or have a garden, but you know, community garden or something, but show them and work with them and plant that garden together. Show how. Tell stories of how people have done it. Learn from history. That's what that, you know, notion of learning from history and how really big changes have happened in the past. What happened? How did they do that? What can we learn from that as for strategy for now? Can you find or use that to encourage and empower people? Can you show people that certain things are working and working together is even more effective? Those are ways in which, you know, you increase that sense of, yes, we can make a difference. And then here are lots of things to sort of think about this ever-changing basis. Can you actually, in what you want people to do and in how you get there, can you stay nimble? You should at all time expect surprises, opportunities. We don't do that. It's not our mode. You know, we want things to be predictable and reliable, but can you make yourself, with your agency, with your partners, once a year, think through, wow, what would really throw us off? How can we prepare for that? How can we think that through? Maybe a way to think or see the change that's happening is to track progress. We're going to be talking about that in Unit 5, even the effectiveness of, you know, your communication. Can you reflect and learn together, adjust your strategies, ask questions about, you know, so how did this happen? What happened? You know, who did what, so that you understand how something comes about. So there's so many ways in which you can, you know, actively get people to be in this uncertainty and be, I don't know if comfortable is the right word, but at least be actively engaged with it as opposed to just being paralyzed by the fact that they don't know. There are so many things we can do to engage that ongoing change in a really big way. There's another way I want to, so these are, you know, just concrete ways that you might find to weave that into your strategy. But I want to give you another heuristic, another tool to basically work with, and that is what I call the 7 ingredients of authentic and grounded or active hope. I've written about it, and you can find that paper on my website. If you're interested, SuzanneMoser.com, go to my publications and under the communication side, and you will find it. But basically, what this is about is that it's a strategy that is grounded actually in how doctors talk to their patients who have maybe a fatal or a very serious disease. As you know, you saw that earlier, there is in medicine this recognition that patients who have hope heal faster. So this is something that there's a real basis to this, and how doctors use this particular recipe. I've extended it a little bit, and I'll talk about it. But basically, a doctor has to essentially start with a clear-eyed diagnosis and deliver that with empathy. You can imagine, somebody coming into a hospital room and just dumping a diagnosis on the patient and walking back out. It's awful, right? It's awful bedside manners. You never want to do that with climate change either. You want to, basically in a very clear-eyed manner say what the serious situation is, but, recognize that this will bring up emotional responses in people. So conveying it with empathy. So this is where we are. This is the baseline. Now, where can we go? What is feasible? What is possible? What is a vision of a worthwhile outcome? And, if you imagine this sick patient, it might be that they have a vision of a worthwhile, that the vision of that worthwhile outcome is they'll be healthy. They'll be fine. Maybe it is, you will have a chronic disease, but you will not die from it, but we can manage that. Or maybe, we don't have a way to heal this, but we can make sure that, as you're dying, you are not in pain, you're not alone, whatever, So the point is, you find out what is the worthwhile outcome in this situation for the people that you're talking with. And then you have where we started, where we are now, to the end, that goal, that vision. What is the path to get from here to there? What is it that I will do? What is it that others will do? So it's very important that people have a meaningful role for themselves in realizing that path. The contribution they make, it's not the whole thing, but they need to make a meaningful contribution. And they also know that you, the doctor, you, the policymaker, you, the other people in this community, will do your part. So what will be my meaningful role? What will other people do? Very important along the way that you have a strategy for setbacks and for interim goals. How often does something happen and people just give up when a barrier shows up, or you have achieved something maybe sooner than you thought you would achieve it, and people say, oh great, now I can go and do something else, and you just lost them and they won't go the next step, right? So you need to have a strategy for how to keep people at it when things get tough along the way, and giving them a sense that we're in this together. A patient who has to face a disease by themselves without the help of doctors and family and community will not do as well. This is medically proven. And the same is true for climate change. We will be overwhelmed if we feel like I'm the only one. In my community, in my business, whatever. This is that whole needing to be part of a collective. So can you create a sense for people that we're in this together, everyone is doing their part, and together we have an impact? And very importantly, you want to then tie that to something really deep inside. And that is that connecting to that sense of purpose, who they want to be as individuals. It doesn't always start in that sequence. You go back and forth. It's not linear. You might have to go from the vision to the call into higher self, and from there to the strategy for setbacks, whatever. But these are the ingredients that I see again and again for people to actually maintain a authentic, grounded, or even a radical hope. So try that can you weave that into your strategy? That's what we're going to do in the last few minutes unit, and I want you to practice that. And that is to think again, hope being one motivation. Are there other ways in which you can give people a sense that, okay, I'm going to do something. I'm going to take this action. I'm going to do something different from what I've always done. Because that is really what you're trying to achieve here, right? You're communicating in order to achieve a social goal. For some people, it might be, yes, knowing more about this is really motivating to them. So that is, teachers tick that way. Students often are really motivated. The more they learn and grow their competence, it really makes them want to do things. For in other instances, it's a matter of tapping into the deeply held beliefs and concerns and values. We talked about this before, or the sense of, being part of, this is what everybody else does. People like myself, the people I care about, do the same thing. Or whatever you ask me to do is consistent with my aspirations for myself, who I want to be in the world. For some people, it is the bottom line. Absolutely, that is a big issue. For some people, it's that they, would say yes to an action because they actually gain something politically from doing it. Some people are basically, you only get them to do anything because the law says so. They will be, only going with that sort of top-down mandate. And for some people, it's actually seeing that, oh my God, this is happening in my backyard. We have to act now. And for some people, it's that vision of a worthwhile future. So it really, I just want to say, the range of what motivates people really varies. There's not one thing that you can always use and it will always work. This is what you need to find out about your audience. What would motivate them? This is why I had you do all this work on the audience. So if you haven't done that yet, or if you have only done it partially, I would invite you to go back and see, is there something that you know about this particular group that you're trying to talk to that would motivate them? Anything that would get them to engage and take this seriously. Sometimes motivation comes from people being really connected to place and wanting to defend it. I did a study one time in Monterey, California, which, if you haven't obviously not been there, it's a gorgeous place on the Monterey Bay and the Pacific Ocean. It's absolutely wonderful, and people think of it as paradise. I use it because you probably think of your place as paradise. Many people say so. I would have loved to see it. Anyway, the point is, people are connected deeply to their landscapes and to what they love about the place, both culturally, environmentally, and socially. So there's something really, really unique about the Seychelles, and people might go a very long way to defending it for what it is. So can you sort of tap into what's unique about your place? What's so gorgeous that would really make people want to defend it? Something that gives them pride or self-esteem or a sense of, yes, I can do this. I have the power to affect it. Is there something that makes people feel safe there that you can tap into, that makes them belong or want to stay, or what they simply feel is worth keeping? If you can do that, putting that into your communication strategy, tapping into what is, because it's so foundational to who we are, it's one of those really deep motivators. And I encourage you to find ways to think what that is and to work that into your strategy. So one of the things I said in the pieces on hope is that empowerment and a sense of we can do something is really critical. There are some really important way in which empowerment is a motivation. The sense that if you can do it, you're more likely to do it because you can. So what does empower? Knowing about the solutions, having a sense that, yes, I know how to enact it. I know how to submit an application to this bank so I can get the loan to get the solar panels, that sort of thing. Or giving people the practical help and skills and confidence and intention to do it. Creating a sense of, you're not alone in doing this. We're doing this together. Already 20 people have applied for this loan. Gives a sense of, oh, it's not so unusual. People have figured this out. It can't be that hard. So that kind of thing is what gives people a sense that it can be done and they can do it. People making public commitments, being leaders in visible ways, to basically make a commitment to, I'm going to do this in the next 10 years and the next 5 years, and then you can hold them accountable. Very helpful when people make those kinds of commitments. It's been shown actually that when people make a public promise, if you ask them to make a commitment in front of a group, they are far more likely to actually carry it out than if you just ask them silently to make a commitment to themselves and then you don't know what it is. Because why? Because they can get away with not following through. But again, it's so important for us to be seen as important community members and to be seen as trustworthy contributors to society. So if you can build in a way to get people to make a public commitment, maybe that might, make it much more easy to get to follow through later on. So can you think of ways to add empowerment to your strategy? Now, another thing that I want to emphasize is what actually are the deepest motivations. We talked already about, this long list of what makes people feel like, yeah, okay, I'm going to get off the couch. But there are 3 things that really, really work for people. And I want to encourage you to go to this link that is here at the bottom of the screen. It is a short talk about the research behind that, and it's actually really fascinating. The first thing that is one of the deepest motivations is autonomy. When you allow people to figure out their own way, when you leave it up to them how to enact something, they tend to do better. They get more engaged than if you tell them, here's exactly how you have to do it. The second one is that people actually have this urge to excel, to get better at something. They want to be masters at what they're doing. So if you can help people become better and better and better at something, they'll get better at it. So think about ways you can foster that in your communication. Maybe start with a small challenge and then get to a bigger challenge, and give them feedback that they're getting better and better at it. Makes people feel proud, and it's just how they want to be. And the last one is purpose. We have an incredible, persistent need for doing things in a purposeful manner, in a meaningful manner. And so this is where this connecting to our deepest sense of self, to our identity, to who we want to be, if you can in any way invoke that, link people to this aspirational aspect of who we are, that's a really powerful way of motivating them to do that. So here is the exercise that I want you to go do. You find it in the folder, Google folder, and where I basically want you to build on your audience exercise and figure out ways you can add emotion and motivations and empowerment to what you want to say to people. How can you tap into those positive emotions? How can you tap into people's sense of place, their identity, their cultural pride? How can you make space for their authentic emotions, all of them, good or bad, and recognize them and speak to them as the whole human beings with 2 brain hemispheres that we all are? How can you add more hope to your key messages, to your strategy? So work on this together with each other, and then come back to this to wrap it up. The last step here that I want to walk through is the issue around barriers, ways to overcome them. This is a list of barriers that you probably have heard many, many times in one variety or another. Why should I do anything? Why now? Can't we do this later? Why should I bother to do anything different from what I'm already doing? I don't have that choice. I don't have the money. I don't have the option. Or I don't want to do it. I don't like doing it. I hate doing it. Or I don't know how. This is a skill issue, right? It's too hard. I can't sustain it. It's too expensive. This is what you hear all the time in one variety or another. I want you to take this list and think through in your situation that you have chosen with the particular audience and the goal that you have in mind. What are all the ways in which people will encounter barriers, this kind of set of barriers? Remember, you're asking them to change, and every change is hard. So is there a way in which you can make that change easier for them? So in this exercise that I have for you, I want you to get together, socially distantly get together with your training partner, call them up and talk about in what ways or what the barriers are that people might encounter, and all those opportunities that people have to check out and not do it and opt out, and then think about, okay, what do I need to do? Do I need to come back to them more often? Do I need to reinforce what we're saying? Do I need to create opportunities where they see other people are doing it, that they get more social support? Do I need to make it simply easier? Do I need to provide incentives? Can I keep them accountable to making that change? In what ways can you essentially look at all the different barriers? And here is just the beginning of a list of possible ones. And can you address them? Because if you don't, you might have just given them all the reason in the world to change, and then they just run into the wall of these barriers and can't enact them. So they're very frustrated. People don't like being frustrated. They will turn off. They will go away. So that's basically what I want you to do. Wow, that was a lot. We're going to wrap this up here very quickly with an outlook to our next session, but just think about this arc of this particular unit. In the first part where I invited you to think about really how big of a change that is in front of us and how much we have to do, and how that really is tapping into people on that human side. It's not just a technical or financial or economic thing. It is dealing with people having to make very big change. And that's emotional, and they will defend against it. They need to be motivated, they need to have hope, and they need to somehow get help to get over the barriers to making it happen. And one thing you will find, and I want to encourage you to do this, is to, every step of this way here that we went through might lead you to refine who it is you're talking about, who the audience is, what you want to say, how you want to say it. Are you really looking at the right audience? Oh my God, there's a new barrier. That means probably I'm working with the wrong audience. This is the process of strategic communication, that you refine and refine and refine by thinking each one of these pieces through carefully. It will make it better. I promise you. It just is not something you can just quickly, do in a 5 minutes and run with it. Okay, what are we going to do next? Again, you have exercises to do. They're not as long. This is the longest part here with this video. If you have any questions for Michelle or for myself, just send them to us, or else we will talk about it again in our next Zoom meeting. We will do debrief and dive into it. It's obviously a lot. We can't do everything, but we will focus on a few of the exercises and engage just like we did today, and maybe even find some time to share and practice what you learned. In Unit 4, we then will think about, well, where are you going to talk about climate change? How are you going to talk about it? What are the different options and channels, and who should you send? Who is the best messenger? Some of that already came up in today's meeting. Again, the same thing, you will find that thinking through the channels and messengers and all those things carefully might lead you to revise how you communicate, who you communicate, and what you want to achieve. It's an iterative process. Did I mention that? It's an iterative process. Okay, with that, that's all there's going to be, and I hope you have fun with this exercise or exercises and with this unit. Thank you so much for being part of it, and stay safe.